Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Snyk. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead of us, but first, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First off, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to just rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live webinar today. You should also receive an email with a link to access that on-demand recording. If you have any questions for our speakers, we want you to submit those to the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. And that's also where you'll find our chat tab, where we want you to engage with your fellow audience members, and maybe some of your comments will influence what we talk about during today's webinar. We do also have a copy of the Pulse Meter available for download if you check out our Handouts tab. That's going to be the main topic of discussion for today. And finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So our topic today is the 2022 Container Security Trends Expert Panel Live Stream. And I'm joined today by Jim Armstrong, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Snyk, Eric Carter, Director of Product Marketing at Systig, and Dan Kirsch, Principal Analyst and Managing Director here at Techstrong Research. So it's my pleasure to let Dan take us away, but thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks, Cody. So as Cody mentioned, today we're going to be talking about cloud security trends. And we at Techstrong Research did something we call a pulse meter, which is meant to be a quick series of polls to understand how our audience feels about a number of different questions. So our audience is composed of folks interested in DevOps, cloud native, development, security, and digital transformation. And across all the polls, we had more than 1,700 responses, which I think is, clearly shows that there's a huge amount of interest around cloud security. Let me hand it off to Jim and then Eric to introduce themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So great to meet everyone and great to be here today. My name is Jim Armstrong. As was mentioned, I'm Senior Director for Product Marketing here at Snyk. So I started at Snyk about two and a half years ago, covering Snyk Container when Snyk added its second product, and we've grown quite a bit since then. So it's been really exciting, and in the last, I think it was just 2 months ago now, time kind of blurs together, but we announced a really exciting partnership with Systig, and so excited to have Eric here with us today as well. Eric, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Jim. And yeah, I mean, it was a good thing that brought us together, and I know we get to do these kind of events together. My name is Eric Carter. I am the Director of Product Marketing here at Systig, but my role is sort of the intersection of products and partner products. So the solutions that we can pull together, whether that's Snyk or whether that's cloud players or whatnot. And here at Systig, we essentially, our goal is to provide solutions that help you make every cloud deployment secure, reliable, and that kind of thing. And you'll hear kind of that unfold during this session.
Great. So let's jump into it. And I just want to remind everyone, we're going to be talking about a few of the data points found in the Pulse Meter report. You can view the whole Pulse Meter report in the handout section, and then we'll follow up by emailing everyone a copy of it. So let's jump into the first question. So we asked folks, does security slow down your cloud deployment? And this is an age-old question. It's security versus pace of innovation. So about 46% said security is a bottleneck. About a third said neither. And almost 20% said security accelerates the process of cloud deployments. So I thought that was interesting, especially the idea that 1 in 5 are saying that security is actually accelerating the process. So wondering if I've got a few thoughts and hypotheses on why the results came out the way they did, but I know Jim and Eric have some thoughts. So Jim, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So I would love to hear from people in the audience. If you have your own thoughts, or especially if you think that security is speeding up your deployments, I'd love to hear kind of how you're making that happen. I do think, two things. One, the fact that you mentioned it's first, it's an old age question, which kind of, I think, points back to the history of my career, which I know is a slip up in wording. But when I started my career, I started with an endpoint security antivirus company. I remember people complaining about security back then, right? Like virus scans take way too long, just slows down our system. So this is not a new problem. It's a different, obviously different category of security and different type of problem here. But you're right, it's been around for a while. I do think it's interesting that people, in some cases, have been able to accelerate their deployments with the use of security. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is the ability to put security earlier into the process, right? So instead of something that you catch, at worst case after it's deployed, or even right before it's deployed, and then it becomes like the roadblock that stops everything from happening. Now with cloud native technologies, containers and IAC and all these other things, we can do all these checks much earlier. So I think that certainly can help, giving people the right tools to sort of address those security problems early, I think certainly can help as well. So I think those are a couple of things off the top of my head. I don't know, Eric, if you see anything interesting.
Yeah, I've been here at Systig now for just over 4 years. So you could argue that's the early days of Kubernetes. Actually, it was right about the time that battle was being won. And as we were working with customers, it kind of what you just said, there was a lot of times when we don't want to deal with that right now. We're going to get live. And then as they went to go live, the security came up, right? And then that's what slowed them down, took extra effort. Wait, is this vulnerability or is this something else, right? And effectively, I think that nearly 20%, Dan, that you mentioned, those are the folks that I think have started to figure it out to do more things around automation. And so they feel secure and they're not stopped when it matters most. It's like you have a deadline and I need to get to prod, right?
Yeah, makes sense. So are you guys seeing security is still sort of at the end of the process? We've got to send code to security, or is security built in throughout the entire process? So it's not, we don't have to pause applications and new projects at the security point.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question. I think it varies. I think we see a lot of customers who want to have security sort of throughout the process. They're not all there yet, right? I think it's an evolution, and lots of things have to happen. I think first of all, defining exactly what you want to secure and what it means for your company to be secure. And a lot of people start with benchmarks and sort of frameworks like that, which is a good place to start. They generally cover a good number of things, but they may not be super specific to your own needs. But I think from there, people start to kind of define exactly what they need. What I think we see a little bit is security still is a little bit behind. Not technically, they get the whole cloud native space, but they're a little bit behind just in catching up to what the application teams are doing, or the DevOps teams are doing, and trying to get like those, what are the right rules and how do we automate all those rules so we don't become a roadblock. We don't want to be doing like manual code reviews, because that's not a good situation for anybody. But it takes time to figure those things out and figure out all the right things to check and where to check them and how to check them, and when to block things and when not to block things, and to educate the application teams too. Like you can't just put a tool in there and expect that magically everybody's going to fix everything, because they need to know what to fix and how to fix it. And if the fix breaks the application, well, then you have to kind of decide what the right path forward is too. So it takes time, I think. But certainly I think, it's getting much better.
Yeah, some things have become quickly, I would call it table stakes. As we moved to containers, like image scanning kind of became much more well known as something, hey, we need to do this. And, the registries you're loading your containers in would have some level of image scanning, and that's good. But then to the right of that, things like, okay, intrusion detection in your running environment, and to the left of that, code security, open source, dependencies and things like that. I think some of those things are the areas where people are growing into, and some are getting it and doing it well. And of course, guys like Jim and I are out there kind of creating things like checklists, like be thinking about all these things. It doesn't have to necessarily be Systig and Snyk. We hope it is, but be thinking about each of these practices, right? And that's from code security all the way through. When something bad happens, can you respond?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, there's, this is, I'll try to avoid the shameless plug at this point, but I think the reason why Snyk and Systig wanted to partner is because I think there is also this sort of evolution of like, as DevOps has kind of taken over on the application side, maybe more strongly, security is kind of still evolving in that direction too. And I think, do we need more visibility on the runtime? Do we need more visibility on the dev time, build time activities? And the answer to that question is yes, right? So what I think people are trying to figure out is how do we piece these things together so that everybody's kind of reading from the same playbook, which I think is, this is the shameless plug part, right? This is like, that's why Snyk and Systig wanted to partner together, is to provide that kind of visibility and workflow.
Yeah, and I think, Jim, you also touched on the idea, no CIO wants to be Dr. No. They want to enable folks rather than saying, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. Eric, you mentioned container security. Are you seeing, when the security team gets involved in cloud native development, obviously they're aware of containers. Are you finding that there's any areas within container security that they're not understanding, or that the security team is looking at it very differently than the DevOps team?
I don't want to offend any security people.
Go for it.
I think that they have arrived in some essence now. But again, thinking about the last 4 years, a lot of these projects, while they achieved flight, but they were a bit on the skunkworks side. And so the security bugs were still concerned with the VMware environments and the bigger things, right? But they would poke their head in every now and then. Now I think they're in a much bigger way. They've been educated, but I do think there are things like infrastructures, code validation, and security that's kind of feels a little new that they're getting their arms around. Maybe some of the runtime processes and what's the best way to sniff out who's doing what in these dynamic environments is a little bit new. But the idea of some of these things, it's all the same. You've always wanted to check for vulnerabilities. You've always wanted to watch the running environment. You've always wanted to make sure your environment is configured correctly so that you're not exposing yourself. And then of course, I'm trying to think of there's always some sort of compliance mandate. But it does get a little more tricky. And so I do think there are some security teams that are like, oh, we better get educated quickly on what does this thing of containers bring? How is it different? And if it is different, are there any things we need to shift and change with how we handle it and what tools we're using? And I think they're pretty much getting there at the moment, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting just in the space of like vulnerability management. Again, another area that's scanning for vulnerabilities in and of itself, not new, right? Doing that for a long time too. I think I'm assuming all of our audience here is like, they're pretty cloud native, DevOpsy by nature of being here, right? But I do see environments where people still kind of treat the vulnerability report, even with containers, like they did the vulnerability report for VMs, 5-10 years ago, and think, well, we'll get it on the next go round or some patching cycle in the future. And it's like, well, that's not how containers really work. Like it doesn't. That's the same vulnerability report has to be looked at a little differently in the container world. The container that you scanned may not exist an hour from now, so it's a bit different. But I think people are catching up. But for sure, I think it's it becomes more a question of like prioritization and figuring out like what are the things to really pay attention to. Saw a really good question here in the chat too about locking down the environment, right, and doing things like setting more of the sort of more granular container engine settings or Kubernetes settings or even node settings that would sort of restrict container capabilities, which I think is a really interesting. It's one of those areas where I think you invest in a container platform, Kubernetes platform, because most of them have a lot of those things set by default as a fairly reasonable and secure place. But I think depending on the applications you're running, you may need more stringent standards and more stringent controls. And so I think that's where it starts to get really interesting, right? Like generally speaking, what our platform gives us is probably good enough. For this area where we're handling credit cards or we're handling sensitive customer data or something, it has to be locked down further and we need better controls or tighter controls. And how do we automate those? So how do we define those in code so that we can check them in CI/CD or wherever we want to check them, and then help people fix them, and understand why those are set. I think that's the challenge.
The question reminds me of the one of the nuances that's different in the container Kubernetes world, which is the concept of a namespace or even a pod, right, and things like that, right? Do you have that context? And that becomes important in the use case that's being asked about here. Like, if I understand the namespace, what it is, where it is, I can apply certain policies to that namespace. To your point, Jim, the one that's got the credit card information over the one that's just sitting in my dev environment that I'm not, there's nothing sensitive there, right? And so that's one of the things we try to do is pick up as many labels and tags that we can, including the constructs of the Kubernetes environment, so that you can say, okay, I'm good with either this cluster, but also these namespaces in these clusters. I want to do certain things to safeguard. And to the extent that you're aware of that, you can get to that fine grain. But if some of the tools you're using just don't understand the concept of a namespace, a pod, a deployment, and those kind of things, you might have a tougher time.
Yeah, I still see, and I think it's a valid question. It's not that it's a bad question. I still see a lot of customers trying to decide, like, am I going to split everything up by namespaces, or am I going to give everything its own cluster? That's not a bad question. I think there are reasons why you might do both, and I certainly part of the security. Security is part of that question, right, or that framework for thinking through why you might split things up that way.
Yeah, so the same participant has a follow-up, whether in terms of container security, offsetting the risks of multi-tenant cloud environments, in terms of isolation from other cloud customers and the cloud provider itself. That's any thoughts on that?
Yeah, interesting. I don't think the container itself is enough to give you isolation. Like, in other words, if I've got 5 customers and I put all their containers in the same, I don't know if that's kind of the picture that's being painted, but run them all in the same cluster. Is there enough isolation there? I would say probably no, right? But I don't know if it's if it's that simple of a question that's being asked.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think, and it depends too, like when you say multi-tenant cloud environment, I think if you're thinking of something, well, like if you think of AWS, I think from the time it gets to your container to somebody else's, environment in AWS, I think there's probably enough. It's not the container though that I think is doing the security. It's everything else underneath the covers that is probably doing the security. If you're doing things like Fargate, each sort of thing that spins up in Fargate might have enough isolation. But if you're doing an EKS cluster, you're rolling your own, Kubernetes on top of a cloud, any cloud really, right? Then I think the questions are more challenging. And no is probably, I think, agree with Eric. Like, the container itself is probably not enough. And especially if your containers are running as root, I think there's a lot of caveats there. If your containers are running as root, and if you're just rolling your own Kubernetes and you haven't changed any of the defaults and all these other things that kind of go into it, that would say, no, I wouldn't just stick with the defaults. But, I think it depends kind of what your entire stack looks like, really.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think when you get to cloud-based containers or Kubernetes as a service, GKE, AKS, EKS, there's, like Jim, you were pointing out, there's going to be separation. There's going to be kind of your own, right? So I think we're good there. I think outside of that, just any Eric's Kubernetes as a service, if I haven't guaranteed the right level of separation, you want to be careful. I mean, in the question is a chance to point out the containers do have some level of let's call it opaqueness, right? In other words, it's like not easy sometimes to see what's happening inside, and that can be good from a security perspective. It also can be bad in the sense, like, what's happening in that container. Do I understand it, right? And so you need vantage points or ways to get to have that understanding. Yeah,
I think you can over-engineer it too sometimes. Like, not every application needs to go super deep. I remember getting questions a couple of years back, people would ask, do we need a service mesh? And the answer is kind of depends. Like it's not, you don't just need a service mesh because you have containers, but you might need a service mesh depending on your environment, the applications you have. Service mesh just being one of those things that might add some additional controls and security, but there is also the danger of like over engineering it for something that, making everything way more complex than it needs to be for specific applications too. So I think it really kind of, you have to look at the applications, you have to look at how your service is set up and, decide whether that's enough for that particular application, I think.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what we're getting to is, Kubernetes and containers are still really complicated. And obviously we've got an audience here that knows a lot about containers, but, so there's also always a debate, do you want an opinionated platform or do you want to create your own? Oftentimes an opinionated platform is easier and will get you off the ground faster, but at the same time, you then want to be able to, as you go up that maturity curve, you're going to want to be able to, finally tune things and if you've got credit card data, for instance, that you're going to treat that very differently than your test environment. And this nicely segues us into the next question, which is, do application teams have enough experience and context to identify cloud security vulnerabilities and cloud misconfigurations? And about 3/4 of respondents said no, and about a quarter said yes. And I think this is indicative of this whole idea of, it's very complex. Developers have to wear many hats, DevSecOps, it was DevOps, now it's DevSecOps. How many things can we force developers to have to understand and know? I mean, at the end of the day, developers need to create awesome user experiences for customers and employees and partners, and they've got to address bugs and make applications super usable. At the same time, now they're responsible for operations, testing, security. So how can they deal with all these different competing priorities?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a challenge. I think this is where a lot of it kind of comes down to tooling and giving people the right kind of information that's sort of relatable for what they do, right? I think and kind of going back to this whole idea of DevOps and DevSecOps, right? Like you need tools to secure your production environment, but everything that you see in in your Systig console, let's say, is probably not something that a developer would be familiar with or know what to do with. And so what you want to do is kind of filter the right information to them. I think that's where the dev first tools like Snyk come in, is like, let's take that security information, but let's give the right context to the application teams so that they know what to do, even if they don't always know exactly why they're doing it, which may sound a little strange, but there was you used to ask the question, I don't think we really ask it anymore for good reason. Do developers care about security? And the answer, a few years back was no, developers don't even care about security. How am I going to do this? And I think that was wrong. I think developers care, but in this big pile of things that they have to do, they're never going to be the experts on security, right? So it's more like, how do we get developers to fix things, fix security issues? I think we have to acknowledge that they're never going to be the deep security experts. But if we can give them the right information to help them sort of wade through the security report and decide or know what to do, then I think that definitely helps things. That kind of goes back to the first question too, like the automation part of it, and how do we get the right tools and the right information to people in the right place so that they know what to do.
And I don't think you want developers to be experts on security. You're going to end up with the most secure application possible for like an online retail store. It takes 10 minutes to get into shopping. It's very secure. You've put it up to your eyeball. It's read your retina scan, but it gets in the way of user experience. So
yeah, it's all text based, and it's just a description of the clothes instead of a picture, right? Yeah, it's not going to be great either.
And I know, Eric, you mentioned automation earlier. I'm sure that must that helps a ton.
Yeah, it does. I was thinking about the question, first of all, like inherent, it's like, we're the application team. We might need to append my business card as the application and security team. Well, that's not really what you signed up for, right? The experience part, okay. I don't know, that's something but that has to come with time. But the context is a part of it. The question was context, right? That's where, automating or giving visibility to the right stuff, letting you kind of click your way through. And I know a lot of developers don't want a pretty UI necessarily, right? But let's say giving you that in a way, and then just being able to make it simple to apply something like a fix or so on. And that's really, what we're talking about in ways to automate the detection and the information, automate, applying a fix, rolling it over, through the CI/CD pipeline, through the, registry, ready to roll, right? So I think that all kind of takes some of that burden off of the shoulders of the application team, but it requires an investment, right? That's for sure.
Yep. Yeah, I think too the context is a really interesting one from I think both perspectives as well, right? Like I think as a developer, it's easy, especially like you think about vulnerability reports. We'll keep going back to that, right? It's easy to get a vulnerability report that's crazy long with containers and going back to VMs even, but with containers that developers are more familiar with. But what do you do with that? Like, how do you parse through 500 vulnerabilities when your day job is actually writing code? You could say, well, we're going to have security do the hard work for you. But again, you get back to the scale issue, and now you're waiting on security to do something. So that doesn't necessarily work really well either. So I think the more you can automate that, the more you can provide that. And I'll just shout out shameless plug again. So what we've done, like with Systig, is you see the running container, you see the packages that are running in the container, and Systig can provide that information back to the developer to say, look, out of the 500 vulnerabilities that we discovered when Snyk scanned it, these 20 are actually active in your application when your container runs. And so those are the ones that probably you want to bubble up to the top of your list and focus on fixing first, right? And then you get the fix information to them so that they know what to do to fix those things. But the same applies to, it's not just containers and vulnerabilities, like anything in this cloud native world. And the flip side, I think, is true too. Like if you're a security person, the naive view of it is we're going to fix every vulnerability. But the reality is like it's very easy to break an application when you start just changing everything so that you get rid of all these, security lights. So it's a balancing act. I think you have to understand the application, how it works. You have to understand the security needs. You have to understand, like, is this an application that's touching sensitive data, or is it just like, this is our opt-in email service, like, or opt-out email service, whichever part of the world you live in that you require, right? It all changes, I think, based on those types of signals.
So have you guys seen any, so increasing automation, sometimes, a developer might not exactly know why they're doing something because they can't be expected to be experts on the security logs and the outputs from a security system. But, there's obviously some culture issues where the security team says, we're not comfortable with the developer doing things without really being security experts. So how do you sort of bridge that? Oftentimes what I see is it's about offering systems or platforms that have common language, common verbiage, so that the security folks and the DevOps people can have informed discussions around the same types of data and problems, so that it's not security is talking security, developers are talking development, and they don't match. Instead, you need to be able to have some sort of common ground that you can talk about.
It's part of why we've been bringing some of these things together, just again as Snyk and Systig, right? To let there be a common understanding. What you said is like, the app folks aren't security experts, but security folks may not be coding experts, right? So you've got to give and take. Now, I do think there's a lot of good information that we can pull in that summarizes what is this vulnerability, the fix, what does it involve, and things like that. So if both teams can be looking at that, they understand what the community, for instance, how is this thing ranked? Is it, is it a high level severity? Is it something worse than that, right? I think getting the information in front of folks that's common does help, right? But even what's interesting is even within vulnerability scanners, there can be varying differences, right? Jim, you probably know that better than I do, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, if you can get pointed and there's enough context for security and understand, there's enough for the app developer person to go do their job. I think it's getting better.
Yeah, we see a lot of companies kind of creating these security champion type groups where, again, I don't think the expectation there is that, a developer is going to be the security expert, but there are developers who are a little bit more advanced in their security knowledge and, understand the best practices. And they're sort of the ones educating the rest of the development teams on secure coding practices in general, and in the right things to do kind of along the way. And it may not be one person, it should be, hopefully in bigger organizations, it's multiple people kind of doing this, but yeah. We see that a lot too.
Setting up like a center of excellence or best practices that can be documented. Obviously people change jobs, so you don't want that, all that knowledge going out when someone leaves the organization.
We had one customer in the automotive industry, let's call it, without naming them, but they did a good thing is that on the front end of getting into some of this new world of containers and Kubernetes, they brought all the stakeholders into a room. And in fact, then they brought, vendors into that same room, and everyone got to voice their concerns, what their care-abouts were, what they believed should be considered in this project. And it was helpful not just to let folks like Systig be able to say, yeah, we can help you with that, or no, whatever the answer was. But it let the common teams, it was security folks, it was platform owners, it was application teams, networking people, all sorts of things, right? So I thought that was a novel approach as opposed to just a few clever DevOps people, trying to spin everything up themselves, right? It ended up with a better, more fully fleshed security picture.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's address, we got a question in the chat, and I'll leave it up to Eric and Jim. You guys can decide who answers it, or you both answer it. Can you trace all pieces of open source software, your bill of materials, of a modern application with vulnerabilities scanning tools?
It depends a little bit on the vulnerability scanning tool. In theory, you should be able to, right? Because if you're going to do a vulnerability scan, you have to get the full dependency tree and put that all together and then match that up with the vulnerability database. In reality, not every vulnerability scanning tool does a great job of that, but the theory is there, yes. I think can you trace that is an interesting part of the question, though, because I think there's a bit of a important part of that, which is, where are you doing this scan, right? Are you doing it often? Are you checking early in the application's lifecycle? Are you checking again at deployment? Are you matching up those bill of materials? Are you really getting what you expected? If you think about something like the SolarWinds attack, where it was sort of in the middle of the supply chain, the vulnerability scan would tell you if there were vulnerabilities, but there really wasn't a vulnerability in the software itself. It was a vulnerability in their supply chain, right? In the pipeline itself. And so I think, if you had audited all the packages early and then you audited all the packages right before deployment, or even maybe slightly after deployment, or both, and then you tried to match those up, you might see some strange things in your software. That's not easy to do, right? Like it's easy to talk about, but it's hard to actually do, because you get these long lists of dependencies and you have to match them up and what version goes with what. And, so it's not a trivial sort of process there, but in theory, vulnerability scanning tools produce at least some sort of bill of materials. And if you are scanning early and often and throughout the life cycle, then yes, you could trace those dependencies all the way through that pipeline, and make sure that you're getting what you think you're really supposed to be getting.
Sounds good. So let's move on to the next data point. And I know we've already got a question that I think will fit in well with that one. So the question was, who's responsible for creating cloud infrastructure configurations? And not surprisingly, folks thought it was a collaboration. I mean, Eric talked about this center of excellence at an automotive company where they got a number of different stakeholders in the same room. So a collaborative approach makes a lot of sense, but then about over a third said cloud platform, and developers, very few are saying developers are responsible for creating cloud infrastructure configurations. So just sort of wondering what you guys are seeing in the market in terms of setting up that cloud platform.
Yeah, I think effectively it resonates with me in a sense because a lot of, I guess the people that leverage Systig tooling are more on that side of the house. Cloud platform might mean we own it and operate it. The cloud platform might mean it's in the public cloud. Either way, there's a whole practice around. It's a very industry term, but posture management, right? Security posture management. Like, are these things set up? Have we plugged the holes? And there are different ways to get there. Different tools. A lot of times CIS benchmarks are used to make sure that, okay, we've got green, yellow, and red, right? Where things are not passing, what can we do to get better? Now, I guess developers might sometimes, that's like, okay, not another thing, right? But I do think Jim probably has a perspective because they are increasingly leveraging things like Terraform and Helm and to make things spin up, right? That's essentially also a part of platform configuration, right? And so they're oftentimes also involved in that. And so developer, that number, may in fact go up, but it does contribute to the collaboration side of the house.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I don't see a whole lot of companies where developers are just off kind of running on their own with the cloud configuration side of things. I think the numbers you have there are pretty reflective of what I've seen too. I do see a number of companies where there's a cloud platform team and they define the core standards and the core configuration. Like if you think of Terraform, right? Everything is sort of defined. The core modules are there. Application teams can kind of pick and choose, from that menu of things that they want to do. Maybe they can tweak a few things here and there. Maybe they can add in a service, or maybe they go back to that cloud team and say, well, we need this database from this cloud provider, and they'll write up the configuration for them. But I think, there seem to be sort of two pieces to kind of unlocking that to doing even more, which is, part of it goes back to the first thing we talked about, which is in order to have the application teams run with it, right? We need more of the controls in place. We need to define what the right output looks like, or what the wrong outputs look like, right? And check for those things. And that needs to be documented. Everybody needs to know kind of what the standards are, and we need to be able to check for it. And that kind of leads into question two, which is, do our application teams have enough context to understand these things? And I think we get that first part, and that goes a long way there. And so then you can start to unleash the development teams to do a little bit more. I don't know that they'll ever just run with everything. That's a little scary probably for everybody, but certainly to do more. But I think it is still highly collaborative. Like the application teams know what their application needs to do and how it needs to function. They may not know how to write it in Terraform or CloudFormation or Kubernetes for that matter, but they can kind of give the right specs, and then maybe somebody else writes it for them until they figure it out.
So let me ask a question from the audience. So this participant just moved into a cloud security team. Their primary role is focusing on app security across the organization, and the company is new to containers. And so one question they have is, they have some teams wanting to move deploying containers into their cloud production environments as part of development, CI/CD. But as things stand, this would break their current ISO 27001 and their SOC audit process. So any recommendations to move forward while not breaking their compliance and audit requirements?
Yeah, there are different, depending on what kind of tools you're using, there are different lenses that you can put on to, because sometimes these, whether it's ISO or SOC 2 or PCI compliance, like a lot of times there's not 100% thou shalt do it this way, but there is a requirement to put controls in place, to document those controls, to test those controls, and upon request, provide an audit of those things, right? And so I know at Systig, what we've done is we kind of broke out the book, chapter, and verse of some of these compliance standards and tried to basically say, okay, in this world, thinking about containers and Kubernetes, when it says to put this kind of network control in, like this is the thing you want to check for, and we can help reflect to you whether you're already good there or you're not good there. So it can be tricky to get compliance in the same way if you're moving it into containers. But a lot of us, even back into the side of vulnerability management, putting a lens there to say, okay, the best way to be SOC 2 compliant or ISO is make sure that the container that you just pulled out and are going to use is not set to run as root, right? And that needs to be flipped and the right permissions put in place. And again, even on the vulnerability management side, there are indicators of you're breaking the rule here and the essence of the rule. So yeah, you're not just going to dump and run and expect to be fully ISO, but this is all, again, part of the controls, the testing of the controls, and the proving that you've done it, right?
Yep. Yeah, and I think, again, the advantage as you move forward with this is that ability, once you have defined all these things, to be able to do those checks quickly, right, and to automate all that and to check things, everywhere, right? Check them while they're in development, check them before they get in the pipeline, when they go through the pipeline, right before deployment, right after deployment, right? You can check all these things and sort of match across so that you have that full visibility in audit in there.
Yeah, and
I think it's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, where people get stopped is one, what you just said, the word, Jim, visibility. Can I see what's actually happening? And do I have the right context? Because these things are spinning up and down and it's in this cluster or this cloud or this region. And maybe it ran for 5 minutes or less, right? It's some of those things become the challenges that are going to be different, not insurmountable by any means, but different. You've got to be able to understand what did that container do. And again, have that as a part of your compliance sort of documentation, not this particular container, but you can see this. And we know that we're keeping tabs on these things. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, no, I was going to say CI/CD can be challenging in and of itself if this is your first foray into CI/CD. Like it's a whole other beast to deal with too. And then getting all your tools in there and documenting all those tools exist for all the pipelines that you might have and all the CI or CD tools that you might have. It can be a bit of a mountain in and of itself. And then on top of it, the complexity of some of these things, like Kubernetes and some of the cloud services and others, right? So there's several, I think, big challenges that are under that one umbrella. I do think it's interesting too to see that, this person has moved into the CloudSec team, but is focused on application security. I think that's increasingly, something that we're seeing. Again, kind of, points back to why Snyk and Systig wanted to partner so much. But this idea that I think even just a few years ago, the cloud team or the platform team was concerned about the cloud or the platform, but the applications there were still sort of a black box. Like they were there, but if we got everything underneath, the plumbing was all right, then we were kind of okay. But I think now the realization is that, we have to have both of these things done well, right? If we get our Kubernetes infrastructure set up perfectly and our app comes in and it's riddled with vulnerabilities, we're no better off, and vice versa. Get the best app in the world, super secure, and we roll with Kubernetes defaults and all the containers are running as root, then we haven't really solved anything there either. So it's a team effort, right? I think that goes back to that, and then probably the reason why somebody chose collaborative on the poll questions is it takes effort from all the teams working together to define what the right standards are and to check all those things in all the right places.
Yeah, and then Eric brought up the idea of visibility, which I think is really important. But visibility without context doesn't get you very far. So you can see all the things in the world and know this is running, but if you don't know why it's running and you can't connect different elements, there's too much data to just sort of look at and expect you to be able to understand everything. So it's visibility, but it's also sort of gaining context and an understanding of what's going on, which is really challenging.
Yeah, it's increasing it, and back to the person who's kind of focused on AppSec. There's this concept of this, especially when you think about public cloud, of a shared responsibility model, right? I think more and more we're getting comfortable that an AWS or a Google knows how to set up a secure platform, right? And so we let go of the reins on some of those things, but what are we still, not completely, but we start to trust, right? But what are we responsible for? We're responsible for what's ending up in that application, in those containers that are getting spun up, and so it makes sense that in some cases, especially when we're thinking about public cloud, our focus starts to go on that, right? The thing that we're spinning up as a microservice or whatever that might look like, right? And you know, it's not just about the dev side. It is, again, you want to be able watching during run as well, because there's all kinds of attacks going on every day. We set up honeypots just to see how this thing happens. Right here it is. Let's put this out there and see how many people immediately try and get in. That's kind of was the underpinnings of open source project called Falco that we created. That's now part of the CNCF. That's all about seeing what is the activity in the running environment and firing off an alert and then letting you do something from there. And on that, we've built some of our solutions. But again, very, very focused on what's happening with the application that we built and are now putting out there, whether it's public cloud or not.
And now I know, Jim and Eric, you guys haven't, you mentioned, your companies a little bit, and Snyk and Systig, but, Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about what you guys are doing at Snyk to address these problems, and Eric, how Systig and Snyk are working together?
Yeah, sure. So Snyk's very much on the developer side of things, right? So we're very much trying to get the security, the right level of security and the right details in front of developers in their IDE, in their Git repos, in CI/CD, right? So that we get things fixed early. So, we work with a lot of security teams who are, who see themselves as the enabler for the application teams. And sort of the business partners with the application teams, as opposed to what we talked about first, which is like, we're the roadblock team. We have to do we're the ones that like wave the magic wand that say thou shalt not. They don't want to do that. They want to be very involved and collaborative with those application teams. And so Snyk is tools that help the security teams and application teams work together, but specifically help the developers fix issues in their code, fix issues in their container designs and that sort of thing early in that development lifecycle.
Yeah, and on the Systig side, we too are focused very much on the cloud and cloud native, the nuance there being whether it's cloud with or without containers, Kubernetes, right? But the securing of those things, and especially along with folks like Snyk, right, helping to find and prioritize software vulnerabilities is a really part of what we do. The thing we're well known for, I just mentioned Falco, but to help you detect and respond to threats in your running environment, whether you're observing what's happening on a container host, or whether you're doing things like, what does the AWS CloudTrail log tell me that somebody just did, and the whole chain of custody between those things, right? To help you manage those cloud configurations. We talked a little bit about compliance. Some of this, you can just automate some of these checks, whether it's a CIS benchmark or otherwise, and try and get it right, the permissions and things like that. So security and compliance are really like kissing cousins, right? They go hand in hand. And so a lot of the lenses that we give you, I like to use that word, or the controls we give you, kind of have those aspects to it. And so that's really our thing. From the same vantage point, we can help you see what's going on from a performance and health standpoint. What's kind of interesting about those two things together is sometimes that security incident is first identified as a CPU spike or memory. Like, it's like, why is it doing that, right? And then you can kind of go dig in. So that's essentially where we try to help, is visibility and control around these cloud and cloud native environments.
Perfect.
Yeah, and then just kind of that integration piece too, right? So if you think about having the visibility on both sides, right, and then linking those two things together, that's really what if you put Snyk and Systig together, there's a broad spectrum that we cover, from the security side of things. But if you link the two together, right, and integrate the two, there's great information. So Systig has all this great information about what's running in the cluster and all those kinds of things. That gets fed back, not all of it, but the important details from like a container perspective, for instance, get fed back. So the developer doesn't have to kind of wade through all that themselves, but they see the details that they need to see in, back in their tools, and can say, okay, well, these are the vulnerabilities out of the 500. These are the ones that are sort of the most critical. We talk about log4shell a lot because it's it's a great recent example. But it's one thing to know you've got log4shell in a container. That's a bad signal. It's definitely something you want to fix. It's another thing to know that log4shell is actively running in your application in the cluster right now. And once you get that level of detail, then that's the thing that says, okay, we're going to stay up all night or all weekend and fix it. But I think if you take that information and you feed it back into the developer tools, and then you can say, well, it's this line of code that needs to change, and that'll get rid of log4shell. Then maybe it's not an all weekend thing; it's a couple hours, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where I think the real power comes in, is having all that visibility, and then also having the right context, as we talked about before, and feeding it back to developers. And developers don't have to go into every detail of log4shell. Just this is the line of code, change it to this, and you'll get rid of it, and you can proceed with your weekend plans. So,
that's paramount.
yeah, exactly. So
just if you guys have any parting thoughts, by all means. I mean, mine is really that I think that the industry is understanding shift left from a variety of angles. One is, by shifting security left, you're going to be able to develop things more quickly. It's out the door without having to go over security hurdle. But then there's also the economics of it. If you're able to address a security vulnerability at the earliest possible stage, it's many times cheaper to address that than if it's already out the door and you're addressing that security vulnerability. So it makes sense from sort of security to be secure, but also the economics make a ton of sense. So you guys have any final thoughts?
I agree with your sentiment, right? Get it solved early. One of the biggest things that's scary is when, have you ever gotten a letter in the mail that says, hey, your data has been breached, but it was like 8 months ago, right? And so why is it 8 months until you notify me? Sometimes because we didn't know, right? And so getting these things taken care of early, putting the right controls in place, it's key. The game changes a little bit in cloud native, but you can solve it, right? That's where I kind of leave it.
Yeah, I think one interesting kind of result from this that we've seen too is when you do start to adopt these processes, right? You do all this additional testing and you automate it. The number of actual security, maybe they're not security incidents, this probably isn't the right thing, but security findings, security issues tends to go up rather than down. But that's mainly because you have better visibility. You're doing more testing. You're testing more often. So it's not unusual to see that number tick up. But what usually goes hand in hand with that is that the time to fix goes down. And so, you're getting ultimately, I think, better results, even though the number of things that show up on a report might increase. But I would argue that's important, right? To Eric's point, like if you find out about it because somebody broke your application and it's several months after the vulnerability was announced, that's the worst way to find out that you've got a security problem. Then you have an incident, right, as opposed to just an issue. So I think those things.
Yeah, you don't want to live with your head in the sand, even though that once it's out, you're going to have this barrage of new information. But if you have a way of sort of triaging it and figuring out what's important and what's not, it's important.
Yeah, for sure.
So Jim and Eric want to thank you for joining, and let me hand it back over to Cody.
Thanks, Dan.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Jim and Eric, as well, for joining us. I'd like to quickly remind our audience that this session was recorded. So following this, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find it on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. So we do have those 4 Amazon gift cards to give away. Our first winner is Yasser A. Our second winner is Paul L. Our third winner is Ivo R. And our fourth and final winner is KTG. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. I would like to thank Snyk for sponsoring today's webinar. I'd like to give a shout out to Techstrong Research for providing the pulse meter report that was discussed today. And my final thanks, as always, goes to you, our audience. We appreciate you spending time with us. We ask for just one extra moment for you to fill out a quick post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But other than that, we do hope to see you at an upcoming Techstrong Learning webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your day.
Ciao.